I want to turn to the budget bottom line because today we saw the final budget outcome, it's called, for last financial year. This is the 2018-19 budget, not the current year that we're in, where the government's staked a hell of a lot on promising and saying it's in fact delivered a return to surplus. Last year it forecast, when it initially handed down the budget, a deficit for 2018-19 of more than $14 billion. Things improved though, particularly with company tax receipts improving, to the point where earlier this year, when they handed down the budget for this financial year, the forecast was, you can see, if we can bring that up, that the deficit had narrowed to just over $4 billion. There it is. The final outcome we see today is still in deficit technically, but really a balanced budget, less than $1 billion. It's $690 or $0.7 billion deficit. So that fact that we're back in balanced budget and certainly on track for the surplus in the current financial year had the Treasurer, Josh Frydenberg, feeling pretty happy.
I am pleased to inform the House that the budget is in balance for the first time in 11 years, Mr. Speaker. With a deficit of $690 million, which is equivalent to 0.0% of GDP, Mr. Speaker. A $13.8 billion improvement on what was forecast when the budget was first handed down in May 2018, Mr. Speaker, and a $3.5 billion improvement on what was announced in April of this year, Mr. Speaker.
So why are we seeing this improvement? Well, the bottom line is company tax receipts are up, income tax receipts are up as well, thanks to more people being in work, and some government payments are down. These figures, though, look at the comparison from the last forecast for this budget that we had. That was earlier this year, so back in April, compared to what we see today, right? So income tax is actually a little bit higher. Company tax, interestingly, is a little bit lower. The GST, though, and this is an interesting story, the GST receipts are down $1.7 billion based on what was forecast just 6 months ago or less back in April. That means people aren't spending. Yes, more people might be in work, but we're not spending, and that's why GST receipts are down. So total receipts were actually softer, about $2.5 billion in all. But when it comes to the spending side, this again is since the last forecast back in April for the 2018-19 budget. The big one there is at the top of the list, the NDIS. $1.3 billion less being spent on the NDIS. And when you compare it, in fact, to what they forecast when they handed down this budget last year, it's $4.6 billion less being spent on the NDIS. All up, a few other areas there as well where you can see payments are down. So that's a big reason why we see the budget bottom line looking healthier. The government's not spending as much. But on the NDIS in particular, a $4.6 billion underspend on the NDIS. How do we explain that? Well, here was the Minister responsible, Stuart Robert, in Parliament this afternoon.
The bilateral estimates had 302,000 expected citizens, but once the data arrived from the states and territories, only 199,000 citizens could be found. 100,000 people of data provided from the states and territories have not able to be found or have been double counted, or frankly the data is wrong. 100,000.
So 100,000 people or thereabouts can't be found. We also heard from the Minister as well as the Treasurer, Josh Frydenberg, about this, that more people are coming into the NDIS, more money is being spent on the NDIS, and that's only going to continue. So why is there this underspend? Why is so much being allocated but $4.6 billion not actually being spent? The Shadow Minister for the NDIS is Bill Shorten. I spoke to him earlier. Bill Shorten, thanks for your time. Why do you think there is this $4.6 billion underspend in the NDIS?
What Labor's saying is that due to faults within the National Disability Insurance Scheme for giving approval to people to get packages of support, the government's been able to pocket $4.6 billion.
Because of delays in
approval of people's plans. Now,
well, more people are coming in, though.
Well, I'm using a bit of jargon here. The National Disability Insurance Scheme is currently looking after 300,000 people with profound and severe disabilities and their families. What it does is it provides or makes people who fall within the criteria eligible for packages of support to go to that person and that family, and then these people spend the money. What's happening is that whilst the government is right that it's 300,000 people getting some packages and there is money being spent, because the NDIS is dysfunctional, a lot of people are not getting their plans approved, are not getting decisions made. So what that's doing is effectively meaning that money which should be going out the door to provide a better quality of life for hundreds of thousands of people is not getting out the door, and the government's putting it in the pocket.
When you say a lot of people aren't getting their plans approved or are taking a long time to get, how many are we talking?
Well, I've been in this portfolio for about 10 weeks and I've travelled around, I've done about 10 big public forums and I've met with a lot more individuals. And I don't think people can precisely measure the waiting list, but I do know the lived experience. There was a lady...
So how do you know there's a lot?
Well, because I'm getting so many complaints.
Like hundreds?
Oh, there'd be thousands of people, thousands and thousands. Like, we're not talking about a couple of people. NDIS is making a revolutionary change in the lives of people with disability. The problem is that because people are waiting 12 months to get approval for a wheelchair, or their plan or their proposed package gets cut, or it gets rejected, or it gets appealed, or it gets modified. What's happening is that a family, say they've got a child with autism, they've got to, get a medical proof of, various treatments. Then what happens is the planner may take 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks to look at the plan, and then they'll come back and ask for more reports. And then they might amend, how much you give them for transport or how much you give them for equipment.
So that drags it out. What's the solution?
Oh, the solution, and it's early days, but I think some of the solutions, because this 4.6, when the government says that they're meeting all the demand and that they can therefore take this $4.6 billion that are allocated for disabled people and just spend it elsewhere, they're not being honest. Because the problem is that the demand's there, but the system to allocate these resources is broken. Or it's not entirely broken, that's too harsh, but it's dysfunctional. If I could use a sort of biological term, the NDIS is constipated.
Right.
There are blockages.
How do you clear that blockage?
What you do is you make sure that the planners, when you prepare your application for a package, you deal with a planner, a government planner.
This is someone employed by the NDIS.
And so what we want is better qualified planners. Some of them are really good.
More planners?
More and better qualified.
Because there is a staff cap. Well,
this is the core issue.
And that still hasn't been hit, though, has it?
Well, the issue is that the government is restricting the number of people who work for the National Disability Insurance Agency. And when you do that, it means that people are taking longer to get their cases
But
dealt
I don't
with.
think the cap's been hit, has it? So
Well, I think that you'll find that there's a lot of people who become planners for 3 months or 6 months. They don't like the job and there's a big churn.
So what can you do about that?
Well, what you've got to do is train up more people, remove the staff cap. The other thing, though, is that you could have people with fairly similar situations and they deal with 2 different planners in 2 different parts of Australia. They're getting different outcomes.
But, I mean,
so there's a lack of
saying,
consistency.
It's about the staff.
It's about the staff, but not just that.
OK, but I mean, I'm just trying to get to how you fix that, because if you've got a cap, but that's not even being hit at the moment.
Well, I don't accept that they're not hitting the cap.
You think they are hitting the cap?
Well, I think that you'll find that the problem is that they're spending such little attention on the workforce that they're getting suboptimal outcomes. But it's not just the planners. Did you know now that there's 1,000 decisions which are being appealed by families in the Administrative Appeals Tribunal? So now what we're seeing is the red tape means that people are reaching for lawyers to get a government payment. This is absurd. Then you look at there's some really basic issues, low-hanging fruit for the government. One of them is that there's a lot of day services who used to look after profoundly disabled people. They're losing funding, and the government should put some money in to help them transition. You've got a whole lot of service providers. There's a lot of red tape. I've met with the psychologists. I've met with the physiotherapists. What they're telling me is that to become an accredited NDIS, service provider, they've got to go through a lot of red tape, and it's expensive. And what we're also seeing is a lot of the service providers quietly leaving the sector because it's too hard, too much bureaucracy. Anyway...
So you'd want to get rid of a lot of that red tape?
Yeah, the long and the short of it is...
Could you end up with cowboys, though, in the system?
Well, you can now, I suspect. The problem is also that there's almost a Hunger Games mentality, a misery games. What happens when say you've got a child with a disability? Your package is only for 1 year.
And then you've got to go through it again.
So you might have had to wait 12 months to get the package approved, and then you've got to apply for it again. You might have got quotes for wheelchairs, and because the government takes so long in processing it, they're out of date. Or that you spend your money writing reports to justify looking after your child.
Look, you know, for a lot of cases, those situations do change, need to be updated.
Oh, it's very simple. More planners, better trained. Less second-guessing of families, more people with disabilities working at the NDIS with lived experience. I also think that we've got to do more about equipment. You know, in Australia, you can go online, you can order anything from the world in Amazon, and it comes in a couple of days. But you've got people waiting for frames and wheelchairs for 2 years.
So, just finally on this, when you
so it's dysfunction, and that's why the government's pocketing the money.
So this is the point, pocketing that $4.6 billion that's underspent, putting it back into consolidated.
Because they say there's no demand, and there is the demand.
Do you think it's so that whatever underspend there is each year should go back into some form?
I think it should. I think one idea they could look at is putting it in an account.
Right.
And if people aren't spending their money because they're not getting the approval, or if there aren't the services in the towns where they live and they can't spend all their package, rather than Mr Frydenberg and Mr Morrison squirreling that money and pretending that all the demand's being met, put it in a separate account.
So have a special fund.
Well,
put it in
one
there.
idea that's mooted by some, I'm not saying it's our policy, but it's one thing which we thought about before the last election.
Right.
Put it in a separate fund, and so then as the problems within the system get ironed out, the money's there.
All right. Bill Shorten, we'll have to leave it there. Thanks for joining me this afternoon.
Yeah, it's an important issue. Thank you, David.
Bill Shorten, the Shadow Minister for the NDIS, speaking to me just a short time ago. I want to return to our top story this afternoon. That's the federal court ruling on the Tamil family of asylum seekers, which essentially means they'll be able to stay. The injunction against them being deported has been extended indefinitely until